I've always been close to my older brother, Zach. Growing up, we shared a room, and even though he was a bit of a troublemaker, I always felt safe with him around. But when we hit our teenage years, things started to change. Zach developed a sleepwalking problem, but it wasn't anything we ever really took seriously. He'd wander around the house at night, sit on the couch, and mumble about random things. Sometimes it even sounded like he was talking to people who weren't there. My parents thought it was just a phase, something he'd grow out of. Mom would gently guide him back to his room, and we'd all laugh it off the next morning. But then, as time went on, it got worse, to the point where it was happening every night. One particular night I'll never forget. I woke up to the familiar sound of footsteps outside our bedroom and assumed it was just Zach sleepwalking again. The footsteps were getting closer, only they weren't his usual soft, careful steps. They were loud, deliberate, until suddenly they stopped. I quietly peeked my head out the doorway, and to my horror, there he was, standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the wall. His eyes were wide open, but they didn't look like he was awake. It was as if he was in a trance, lost in his own world. I reached out to him, but as soon as my hand touched his shoulder, he snapped to attention. His gaze locked onto mine, and he whispered, "Don't let them find me." Before I could say anything, he turned and walked into the kitchen, the sound of his bare feet slapping against the floor echoing in the silence of the house. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest, not sure what to do. When I found him standing by the fridge, I grabbed his arm, trying to wake him up, but he just smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, unsettling. He turned to face me and whispered again, this time more urgently, "You don't understand. They know I'm awake." Terrified, I tried to pull him back toward his room, but he yanked his arm free, saying, "I have to go out. They'll find me if I don't leave." Before I could stop him, he bolted for the front door. I chased after him, shouting his name, but he was already outside. It was a cold night, and he was wearing nothing but his pajamas. I panicked. I ran after him, calling for help. But when I finally caught up to him at the end of the block, he was standing still, staring into the distance again. His expression was blank, as if he wasn't there at all. When I touched his shoulder again, he woke up as if nothing had happened. What am I doing out here?" he asked, looking around, confused. I didn't know what to say. He didn't remember any of it. None of the walking, none of the whispering, none of the strange things he'd said. It's been years since that night, but I can still remember it like it happened yesterday. I'm in my early 20s now, living on my own, but my brother still lives with our parents. They tried everything over the years, sleep studies, medication, therapy, but nothing has helped. Zach still sleepwalks, every single night. I never really realized how much it affected me until I moved out and started living on my own. Every time I visit, it's like I'm walking back into a bizarre world. The house hasn't changed, but the air feels different, heavier. Mom always seems on edge, like she's expecting something terrible to happen. And Dad sleeps in the living room, so he can monitor Zach when he walks. They've installed alarms on all the doors and windows now, hoping to keep him from wandering outside again. But sometimes, when I'm there, I hear the soft creak of the floorboards in the dead of night, and I know Zach's up again. I was only 9 years old when it happened, but the memory has stuck with me like a scar I can't ever seem to shake. It wasn't the first time I had slept in my parents' bed during a storm. and it certainly wasn't the last. We lived in a rural area on the outskirts of town, and thunderstorms around here weren't just storms. They were full-on spectacles. The kind of storms that seemed to take over the entire sky and roll in so fast that you never had time to prepare for them. That night, the storm had come out of nowhere. One moment, it was a calm summer evening, and the next, the sky cracked open with flashes of lightning that lit up our entire yard, followed by thunder so loud I thought the house might collapse. My parents didn't even have to tell me. I'd already climbed into their bed before they could offer. I wasn't scared of storms, not really. But something about the chaos outside always made me want the comfort of their presence. The bedroom was quiet, save for the sound of the rain pelting the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder. My dad had already fallen asleep, his snores filling the room with a rhythmic hum. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to get comfortable, but the storm kept me alert. Lightning cracked again, illuminating the room, and in that brief flash of light I saw something strange, a shadow moving across the window. I froze. I couldn't tell what it was at first, just a fleeting glimpse of movement, but it had been enough to catch my attention. I turned toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The window was slightly ajar. Not enough to be wide open, but just enough for the storm's breeze to filter in. I could hear the rain hitting the glass and the wind rustling the branches of the tree outside. It was then that I heard it, the faintest tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. My stomach turned. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping continued, slow and methodical, like someone was knocking on the window. I turned to look at my parents. My dad was still snoring, undisturbed. My mom lay next to him, turned away from me, her back to the storm. I could feel the tension building in my chest, the air in the room growing thick and heavy. The tapping persisted, louder now, almost as if it was being done on purpose. "Mom?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. But my mom didn't respond. I didn't want to get out of bed, but I couldn't ignore the sound. I slid out of the covers slowly, trying not to wake anyone. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved toward the window. My breath came out in shallow bursts. I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. When I reached the window, I hesitated. My fingers lingered on the curtain, and I wondered if I was just imagining things. Maybe the wind was messing with my mind, playing tricks. But the tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. I pulled the curtain aside just a little. The night outside was dark, the yard lit only by occasional flashes of lightning. But then, through the rain, I saw him. A man, standing in our backyard. I couldn't make out his face. He was too far away, too shrouded in shadow. But I could see his figure clearly enough, tall and thin with broad shoulders. He didn't move, not even when the next flash of lightning illuminated the yard. He was just standing there, staring directly at the window like he was waiting for me to notice him. My heart skipped a beat. I stumbled back, my body stiff with fear. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I quickly ducked behind the curtain, trying to hide, but my mind raced. Who was this person? What was he doing out there in the middle of the storm? I told myself it was just a neighbor. Maybe someone who had gotten caught in the rain. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't make sense. No one in our neighborhood would stand outside in a storm at this hour. It was past midnight and everyone else had long been asleep. I glanced back at my parents. They were still asleep, oblivious to the danger I felt lurking outside. I waited, holding my breath, hoping the figure would leave. But he didn't. Not even after several more minutes passed. His presence felt like a weight pressing down on the room, and I couldn't shake the sensation that he was watching, waiting for something. Finally, I did what I should have done from the start. I turned and ran back to my parents' bed, pulling the covers up over my head. I pressed my face into the pillow, trying to block out the pounding of my heart. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time the wind howled or the rain grew louder, I thought I'd hear the tapping again. But it never came. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the sun was rising. It was a quiet, peaceful morning, and the world felt normal again. But I knew something had happened, something that didn't feel right. I kept thinking about the man, the way he stood there, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the window. I kept asking myself if I had imagined it. Maybe I had. Maybe the storm had gotten to me and my mind had played tricks. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I never told my parents. I didn't want them to think I was making things up. They would have probably told me it was just a shadow from the trees or a trick of the light. But that didn't explain the tapping. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, but the feeling, the gnawing sense of something wrong, never really left me. It wasn't until a week later that I found out the truth. I was in the kitchen with my mom, helping her prepare dinner while she was talking on the phone with one of our neighbors, Sandra. "I guess they're still looking for that man," she said casually into the phone, chopping vegetables. I froze. "Yeah, they think he was involved in some kind of break-in up the street," she continued. "The police have been asking around, but no one's seen him since." My stomach dropped. I knew it. It had been him. The man I had seen standing in our yard. He had been there, staring at the window, tapping on the glass. No one remembers this late-night show but me. I was 7 when I came across the strangest talk show I'd ever seen. It was 1983, and one of those restless summer nights where the air felt thick and heavy, and sleep just wouldn't come. My room was dark, except for the faint glow of my nightlight, but it didn't help. I hated nights like that. So, like I had done many times before, I slipped out of bed, tiptoed down the stairs, and crept into the living room to watch television. I wasn't supposed to be up. My mom would have been furious if she caught me. But I like these quiet moments alone. There was something comforting about the way the TV filled the emptiness of the house, like it was keeping me company. I grabbed the remote and started flipping through channels. Infomercials, old black and white movies, static. Nothing interesting. Just as I was about to turn it off, I landed on something strange. It looked like a late-night talk show. The set was dimly lit, with an old wooden desk and a faded red curtain in the background. The colors on the screen were washed out, like an old VHS tape that had been played too many times. The host was a tall, thin man in a dark suit, sitting behind the desk with perfect posture. But his face, I couldn't make it out. It wasn't blurred exactly, but every time I tried to focus on it, my eyes just seemed to slip away, like my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then he spoke. "Welcome back," he said in a voice that was slow and deliberate, the words stretching unnaturally. His tone was strange, too deep, too smooth, like it was being played at the wrong speed. I stared at the screen, confused. We have a special guest tonight, the host continued, his hands folded neatly on the desk. Someone who's been waiting to see you again. A cold feeling crept up my spine. The camera slowly panned to the guest chair. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I saw it. A figure slouched forward, head tilted low, sitting perfectly still in the shadows. My stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving. Then, as if it had been waiting for me to notice, it lifted its head, and I felt my entire body go numb. It was me. Sitting in that chair, wearing the same striped pajamas I had on in real life, the same messy hair, the same wide eyes. But its skin was wrong, too pale, almost waxy. Its lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile, but its eyes remained blank, dark, empty. I gripped the remote so hard my fingers ached. The host turned back to the camera. "Say hello," he said, his voice calm. The thing in the chair cocked its head slightly, then opened its mouth, and I heard my own voice. "Come back." But it wasn't quite right. It sounded distant, like a recording being played back on an old tape. I turned the TV off so fast I nearly threw the remote. The screen went black, leaving me alone with my reflection. My face looked pale, terrified, staring back at me in the glass. I ran to my room and hid under my blankets, heart pounding. The next morning, I tried to tell my parents. They laughed it off. "You probably just had a nightmare, honey," my mom said, ruffling my hair. "You shouldn't be watching TV that late anyway." But I knew what I saw. That night, when my parents went to bed, I snuck back downstairs and turned on the TV again. I flipped through every channel one by one, trying to find it. Nothing. No late-night talk show. No strange host. Just static and reruns. It was like it had never existed. Years passed. I didn't see the show again, but I never forgot it. Even as I grew up, as the years blurred together, the memory of that night stayed with me. The way the host had spoken so certainly, as if I had always been watching. The way my own double had smiled at me, with something that felt knowing. I told a few friends about it in high school. They laughed. One of them even joked that I must have fallen asleep in front of the TV and dreamed the whole thing. But I knew better. Then, when I was 19, I saw it again. It was the summer before college, and I was staying at my parents' house one last time before moving out. One night, unable to sleep, I went downstairs to grab some water. The house was quiet, dark. As I passed by the living room, I saw a faint glow coming from the television. I frowned. I didn't remember leaving it on. I stepped inside and reached for the remote. Then I froze. The screen flickered. A dimly lit stage, a wooden desk, a red curtain. My blood turned to ice. The host was there, sitting just as I remembered, hands folded neatly in front of him, waiting. As soon as I saw him, my chest tightened. I wanted to turn away, to run, but I couldn't move. The host tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging me. "Welcome back," he said. The camera panned to the guest chair. I already knew what I would see. The figure sat there, slouched in the shadows. But this time, it was different. It was still me, still wearing my clothes. But it wasn't 7 years old anymore. It had grown up. It looked exactly as I did now, 19 years old, with my short, messy hair, my tired eyes, my old hoodie. It smiled. My stomach twisted. The host turned to face me again, his voice smooth and unwavering. "You've been gone for so long," he said. I reached for the remote with shaking hands. The figure in the chair spoke in my own voice. "Come back." I slammed the TV off. Darkness swallowed the room. I stood there for a long time, my fingers still gripping the remote like a lifeline. I never turned that TV on again. And when I moved out the next week, I left it behind. I told my parents it was broken, that they should throw it out. I don't know if they ever did, and I don't want to ask. Since that night, I haven't watched television. Not once. Not in my apartment, not at a friend's house, not even in the background at a bar. I can't. I won't. I threw out every TV I owned. I avoid electronic stores. If I stay at a hotel, I unplug the screen before I sleep, because I know if I ever turn one on again, just once, he'll be there, beckoning me to come back. I spent most childhood summers at my grandma's house in rural Pennsylvania. She was sweet, always baking, always making sure I had enough blankets at night. But I hated her basement. It wasn't just the normal childhood fear of basements being dark and damp. Grandma's basement was different. It smelled musty, but there was an underlying scent I could never place, something metallic like old pennies. The stairs creaked no matter how lightly you stepped, and the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the room, leaving long, deep shadows against the cracked cement walls. But the worst part was the door. It was at the very back of the basement, half hidden behind rusty shelves stacked with old canned goods and boxes of things my grandma never touched. I never questioned it until I was 8 years old and had to go down there alone to grab a jar of jam for breakfast. I hated every second of being down there, but I hurried, eager to be done with it. That's when I saw it. The door. It was plain wood, but the handle was strange, round and old-fashioned, made of something that looked like tarnished silver. I took a step closer. Then I heard the whisper. It was quiet, coming from the other side of the door. It didn't sound like words, just the rustling of something moving. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to run, but I was too afraid to move. Then the doorknob turned. I dropped the jam jar and bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. I slammed the basement door shut behind me and ran straight to the kitchen, breathless. Grandma was at the stove, flipping pancakes like nothing had happened. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" she asked, not even turning around. "There's someone in the basement," I gasped. "Behind the door." She paused for just a second, just long enough for me to notice, before she turned and gave me a soft, knowing smile. "Oh, honey," she said. "You must have imagined it." I wanted to argue, but the way she looked at me made my stomach turn. I never went back down there alone again. Years passed, and I stopped spending summers at Grandma's house as often. But when I was 16, she got sick, and my mom sent me to stay with her for a few weeks to help out. I had mostly convinced myself that the door incident had been a mix of childhood imagination and fear. But one night, after putting Grandma to bed, I heard something. A creaking sound. Slow and rhythmic. The basement stairs. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pretend I didn't hear it. But I did. So I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed toward the basement door. The sound stopped. I stood there, breathing heavily, debating whether to open it. Then a loud thud against the basement door, like something had slammed into it from the other side. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My first instinct was to wake Grandma, but I hesitated. She had always acted like there was nothing wrong with that basement. Would she even believe me? Another bang, and then the handle began to turn. I ran straight to my room, locked the door, and didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Grandma was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She looked frailer than I'd ever seen her, but she smiled at me like everything was normal. "You okay, sweetheart? You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed hard. "Grandma, what's in the basement?" For the first time, her expression faltered. Just a flicker. But I saw it. She set down her teacup and sighed. "You're a smart girl," she said. "So I'll tell you this once and you'll listen, okay?" I nodded. "That door's been there longer than I've lived in this house," she said. "My father warned me about it when I was little, just like his father warned him. It doesn't open unless you invite it to." She leveled her gaze at me. "And you must never, ever open it." I felt cold all over. "But what's behind it?" She shook her head. "Some questions don't need answers." I left Grandma's house a week later, and she passed away that winter. I haven't been back since. The house still sits there empty. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I hear something. Just the faintest sound of a creaking doorknob. And I wonder, if the door ever opened, would anyone be able to close it again?